So, okay, we want to move to transformational change, right? What is the biggest roadblock to achieving transformational change?
Oh, the biggest roadblock, like to think outside the box, I'd say it's a lack of imagination. Really.
Right.
Like, we have so many talented and highly trained foresters and natural resource policymakers. We really do. I really believe that. And yet, I don't know if we create the space that we need to, again, like accept our humility and envision what our future should look like.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is with PhD candidate Ira Sutherland. He is a registered professional forester in the province of British Columbia in Canada, and like I said, also a PhD candidate at the UBC's Faculty of Forestry. He's written a few papers that I thought we should really dive into. These papers are all about the institutional structure that creates the forest management scheme that we have here in Canada. And it's really a really good conversation to understand the impacts of colonialism and the way we think about forests and how we manage forests. And it's not just applicable to Canada or to BC. This is applicable really to anywhere where the governing body came from colonialism, right? This is where I think this applies as a good, interesting dive into understanding these structures. And Ira really gets into the institutional structures in a way that we can understand how they're standing in the way of progress, standing in the way of change. I feel like we talk a lot on this podcast about the changing tides in forest management, how things are moving, how we're trying to conceptualize the forest differently. And he points out that the institutional structure, the governing body or, capitalism and all that kind of stuff directly stands in the way of that and makes it very, very difficult. So by understanding that, we're able to blow through these barriers a little easier, I think, and at least understand them to the point where we can maneuver around them. So there's a fantastic episode. Really check it out. Both the papers are going to be linked in the show notes. Like I said, I think this is applicable to anyone really in the colonial world because it's going to be applicable to that. Sponsors for 2024, West Fraser is the number one. Without them, this would not be possible. Thank you, West Fraser, for your support over the years. Couldn't do it without you. And also Greenlink Forestry, been with me since the beginning. Couldn't do it without them. Thank you, Greenlink. All right, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation about the future of forest management and some of the structures that might be standing in the way. Here we go. Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it. It's funny, just off the top of my head, I think I've spoken to more people from UBC this past 2023. This episode's coming out in 2024, but 2023, then I think I have the rest of my episodes combined. So I don't know. I guess I've been focused on BC a lot lately. I don't know. Lots of good stuff coming out of UBC. It's good. So the two papers that I was reading of yours to prepare for this, right? The 2016 paper about quantifying non-timber values and that kind of thing, and then the 2023 one, which is more about institutional pathways and kind of what's standing in the way of that next step in sustainable forest management is kind of how I summed it up in my mind. Anyways, I'm sure you have a different way to put it, but we'll get there. I found myself wondering, how did you get onto this specific topic of, it seems like you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we actually achieve what the next step is in sustainable forest management? Why did you do that deep dive?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I'll pull that back to my undergrad again. So I studied natural resource conservation, and in that program, we engaged pretty deeply with a broad variety of environmental challenges in BC and elsewhere in the world. And, I just had this, to use a metaphor, like a fire burning inside me that was like, oh my God, our world is kind of in major trouble here, and we need to do something about this. One of the conclusions is it all kind of harks back to capitalism and a narrow view of the world, and how do we maximize our utility for managing landscapes. And at that time, the ecosystem services paradigm had kind of established itself, and it presented itself as this alternative model, where instead of just focusing on those aspects of the landscape where we can maximize monetary benefit, we should really be putting a lot more effort into trying to recognize and understand the multiple other values, whether they're, regulating the quality of the environment, or they're intrinsic to our cultural well-being and sense of meaning and quality of life as humans. And I was really surprised that in the program that I took, we didn't engage a lot with that ecosystem service way of thinking.
Yep.
So I was quite fortunate that in the last year of my undergrad, I was kind of shopping around for a directed studies project, like kind of an opportunity to do a 3-credit class, but have it something more applied, and kind of develop my own course essentially. And UBC plant operations for the Vancouver campus, there was an individual there named Jeff Nolte who was looking for a student to do a directed studies project on the urban forest, or the urban canopy of UBC, and apply an ecosystem service framework to help the broader community and planners understand that the urban forest is, more than something that just looks pretty. It also contributes manifold benefits to the community as a whole.
For sure.
So I adopted that, and that was kind of my first opportunity to interact with this framework and apply it. From my perspective, it was just, it's really what was missing. And in my view, if we could better recognize all these different values, understand them, put them all on the same table, then almost certainly those people making decisions would be more likely to make a holistic decision that didn't just prioritize development or timber values, but to try to balance things out.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That makes sense. Yeah, I think it's kind of the goal. I think everybody, when they come out of like forestry school, you kind of go, you're like, all right, like what is the ultimate way to do this, right? Like this, it's always changing, obviously. Our idea of sustainability is always on the move, and so we're always trying to keep up with it. And so it's a fun pursuit to be like, okay, what now? What are we missing now? What do we want to make sure we're not losing in the future that we're not aware of currently? And it's just a fun idea all around. And because it's so massive, it's such a huge undertaking to try and understand this entire system, right? It's just, it's a lot. And it just seems like something that everyone wants to try to, I want to have the picture clear in my mind of what that looks like. And it's an endless pursuit.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes we have to do things radically differently than we've done in the past in order to figure that out. I feel like that's something we forget sometimes. Is that really it's our imagination and sense of creativity that's limiting our opportunities to do things more sustainably. Our comfort. Instead of doing something similar and showing how we could do it a little bit better, I kind of wanted to apply this framework that nobody else was applying and show what it meant for how we view our forests.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. So before we get into the 2023 paper a little bit and talking about these institutional pathways, and it's an interesting title for the 2023 paper, Dynamics in the Landscape Ecology of Institutions. I was like, oh, like that's an interesting title, because it makes you think. You're like, what do you mean the landscape ecology of institutions? And then now you have to read more. Luckily, I get to talk to you, so this is good. But before we get into this, I think we're gonna go into sort of some of the issues that are standing in the way of that next version of sustainable forest management. I want to get you to give us your personal version of what you think sustainable forest management should look like. What is truly sustainable forest management?
Sure. Yeah. And, maybe I'll just sort of offer my vision of sustainability a bit more broadly, because I feel like we sometimes get too many connotations wrapped up in particular terms.
Sure. Sounds good.
Yeah, but in my PhD, I put a lot of thought into how I define sustainability, and that's partly because I had a committee member who really challenged even using terms like that, so I had to think very carefully about it.
Right.
So as I define it, sustainability is a dynamic process of stewarding landscapes that's guided by an inclusive recognition and monitoring of diverse values or ecosystem services, coupled with an adequate societal response that can ensure the supply of those ecosystem services into the future.
Okay.
So the key thing there is it's a dynamic process. And I was listening to Gary Merkel's conversation in the previous episode, and he also sort of took that view. It's never something we get to. It's a sort of a mindset and a process of acknowledging and having humility for how difficult it is to even imagine what sustainability really is or what it should look like on our landscape. So it's this constant process of learning.
Yeah.
But within that, I recognize, that an important part of that is it is built on a foundation of having an inclusive recognition and attention towards all the diverse contributions of forests and of landscapes. And without that, and kind of, continually growing to further that understanding as well.
Yeah. That makes sense. That it's interesting to add that feedback loop of values to society kind of thing, right? Like that feedback loop of okay, it's dynamic, it's changing, constantly changing with the times, but also we need the societal feedback to make sure that it's changing with the times in the right direction, right? That's interesting.
Yeah. And
like
and the other thing about that is, so we need those response feedback loops, and I say that we need adequate responses. So that means that, in a relatively small scale challenge, an adequate response might be a small adjustment on a, timber harvesting plan, like a spatial adjustment. But if the magnitude of challenges like, climate change and our forests are burning way faster than we ever expected, then that type of response that's adequate might actually be like a pretty significant transformation and in acknowledging the limits of what we thought we knew and asking ourselves questions about, why do we think this way, and who's to say that any of us actually know what the right answer is? Like,
go in with humility, right? Like Gary Merkel said, I should really write the quote down that he said. He said it on like 2 episodes that I've recorded with him now, something about being comfortable in a space that you know infinitely nothing about. I think that's totally true of it, right? I think and especially it's tough. It's tough in a society that, we're a capitalist-based society where organizations, institutions like a big company, right? Like it's like a freighter ship. That thing's not made for fast articulating movements where it can weave in and out of these values. It takes a decade to shift it into one way and to maintain in business. So it's a slow movement, right? And so I understand why that exists, but it's important to have a better feedback loop to maybe try and speed up some of those changes. And there's a lot that goes into that. So okay, I want to dive into this paper now. I want to dive into in the paper, the 2023 paper, talking about the landscape ecology of institutions. You first define a little bit of the situation that's going on, and this is based off of BC only, and like mostly coastal BC, right?
It's actually provincial wide, so we focus on old growth forests is one of the key issues, and also wildfire management, which is more of an interior British Columbia phenomenon.
Right, of course. So you give a little bit of a background, right? Okay, what is the situation today? You're talking about historical forest management, historical logging from colonial times, all the way up to today, where we have arguably over harvested a lot of stuff and for a sustainable yield perspective, right? And then also reduce some ecological function because of that. And then also we've added climate change to the mix, which has added pine beetle outbreaks that has killed massive amounts of pine forests. That was, at least in Western civilization's time, hitherto unknown. And then on top of that, more fire that are bigger. So you've got this three-pronged thing happening. We've got people on the landscape that are doing more than we should. And then you've got climate change. And with climate change comes the pine beetle and the fire and more storms and more all this kind of stuff. So we're in this situation where it feels to me, and I'm going to give you a second here to talk, but it feels to me like we're kind of in catch-up mode now in BC. You're almost behind the eight ball, and you're like, okay, now how do we get back to someplace that's actually manageable in a real way?
Yeah, absolutely. So just as you said, we're sort of in this world where our forests have dramatically changed around us. Like, I don't think anybody disagrees with that. And the question is, like, how are our institutions changing as our forests change? And I kind of frame that question in an academic sense, like, where one hypothesis states that, institutions are constantly monitoring changes in the environment and are constantly adapting and evolving in response to those changes. So that's like a close coupling hypothesis of institutions and landscapes. And the alternative hypothesis is that, well, institutions don't change over time, no matter how the forest is changing, because either because they're actively trying to preserve themselves or because they're simply constrained due to historical, investments and other path dependencies. So that even if they did want to change, if they knew that change was the right thing, they would have a very hard time to do it because they're not aware that, these policies created a long time ago, like the Forest Act in 1948 or what have you, are actually kind of locking in our behavior today, unbeknownst. So,
yeah.
So that's kind of how I frame that theoretically. And then we tried to sort of reconstruct how institutions in BC evolved over time in response to ecological conditions, but also in response to social and political and economic changes in British Columbia.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a really, really cool. It's the only paper I've come across, and to be fair, it's the only paper I've come across of this, maybe because you guys sent it to me, but maybe there's more out there, but it's the only one that I've come across that I've read that's gone into this kind of depth of, like, very fair, right? Like the way you said it, the way you just explained it, right? You're like, it's possible that institutions are moving as slow as they are because there's historical policy, legislation, and institutional structure that makes it very, very, very challenging to change, right? There's just roadblock after roadblock. It's not like there's a free reign to try something new. It's very regimented. And I found it was really interesting to see some of those thoughts about, capitalism pulled into the forest management idea, right? And okay, what is really the holdup? What are the roadblocks that are stopping this from happening, right? So when you guys are examining the system, what did you find?
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of comes back to what you just said regarding the interaction with capitalism. So, at the core of our forest management institutions historically, a colony was set up here in British Columbia by and sort of approved and supported by England, but only on a condition that the colony could fund itself, which it planned to do through developing natural resources and collecting royalties and taxes from mining and fisheries and timber primarily. So that's sort of like the nucleus under which our whole forest management institutions have evolved since then. And perhaps we can see some traces of that still. But then beyond that, like, the story is much more complex. So I could describe some of the sort of key overarching dynamics, if that's helpful.
That'd be great. That would be really, really helpful. I think it's good for people to have a picture in their mind of like, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? What is this? Like, we're talking in big, what is the institutional pathways and the legislative structure? And it's like, it gets a little bit hard to vision. So yeah, if you can make it easier, that'd be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just define institutions and how we define it in our paper. So institutions are the formal and informal sets of rules and norms that govern how society manages or interacts with forests.
Sure.
So that includes policies, but it also includes agreements and relationships, like the fact that the province of British Columbia has jurisdiction, and we think of the province of British Columbia as having the right to make laws and rules. Like that's sure. An institutional arrangement. Yeah. So in that study, I further disaggregated that concept, looking at institutional structure, which is those main relationships governing who has the rights and access to different natural resources. And then there's institutional functions, which are the management approaches and other instruments that are used by those in power to carry out their objectives. Like if the objective is to maximize royalties and taxes from natural resources, we develop sustained yield or other paradigms to help other institutional functions to do that. And then institutional processes are the actual activities on the land base, so timber harvesting, wildfire suppression, tree planting, that then affect changes in the ecosystem. And then as a key feedback from that is we have a fourth institutional process of monitoring, so acquiring information about changes in the ecosystem that can then feed back to change our institutions. Yeah, and so I guess what we found is when you look at institutional structure, the key change is really the arrival of the provincial colonial government that kind of inserted itself as the main decision-making authority for all lands in British Columbia. And right. In the pre-colonial era, of course, we had well over 200 different First Nations, and they all had, various systems of rights, communally or individually, in terms of who was able to use what resources on the land base and how it was to be used. And so the institutional structure, once colonization happened, it didn't change a lot in British Columbia. I basically have a timeline in my paper showing that the provincial government remains at the center of the sort of institutional structure of British Columbia through to present. You do see a couple important changes. One is that environmental non-governmental organizations carve out some decision-making power in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, such as through using international boycotts against BC timber products, which they use to leverage power and kind of claim a spot at the decision-making table.
Okay.
And then more importantly than that, of course, is since the 1970s, we see First Nations having their traditional ancestral rights be recognized through case law in BC. So that slowly, because that started in the 1970s, but is still ongoing to the present, has been a slow transformation away from the provincial government being the sole kind of main decision maker.
For sure, of course.
So overall, institutional structure has proved remarkably stable through time, essentially.
Which is a little worrisome.
It is, yeah.
It's not really changing with the times. You're like, you mean we got the same institutional structure more or less that we had in 1865 or whatever? Like, you're like, yeah, pretty much. You're like, huh. That is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and we sometimes forget to question that, to be honest.
Right.
And so there's a lot of scholarship now, especially from the social sciences, who are, focusing on questions of how do we decolonize or how do we truly create, sustainable landscapes. And a lot of times that answer comes back to we need to broaden who's allowed to be involved in making these decisions. Like that's one of the key environmental challenges. So in that paper, we address it as the sort of institutional structure.
Okay, gotcha.
And then the institutional functions are much more complex. But as I mentioned, when the colony was originally set up, it had a mandate to fund itself through natural resource management. The interesting thing, though, about British Columbia's formation in natural resource management is that a lot of it happened around the turn of the century, which is when resources in a lot of other parts of the world, including the United States, had already been significantly depleted. So,
for sure,
the great eastern pine forests of eastern Canada and Michigan had been completely decimated. A lot of forests already in California had been completely overharvested.
Yeah.
So BC kind of came into the light at a time when there was actually a growing conservation movement, especially in the United States. We had the President of the United States, Roosevelt, was a champion of national parks, and we saw the creation of Yosemite and also national parks here in Canada. So that conservation paradigm is called wise use. It's a sort of paradigm of we can't squander these resources. We have to use them wisely for the betterment of society.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a utilitarian conservation view of the landscape. And so
funny,
early on,
it's one of those ones where, colonists got to the New World. They're like, look at this. It's so plentiful. The resources are never ending. And then, 100 years later, we're like, well, shit. We, maybe not so never ending. And then everyone's like, well, okay, maybe we should think about backing off a little bit. Maybe we don't have to go quite so hard. It's funny how it just, until you recognize the full extent of what you've done, right? Like the consequences to your actions, you don't really learn much.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes we're lucky to learn from other places' mistakes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, a couple ways that was implemented in BC, that kind of thinking. One is a lot of area was protected as forest, not as park, but this area is going to stay as forest. It's not going to convert to agriculture. So there's a lot of that. And then the second was a really strong focus on the waste brought about by early timber harvesting practices, for one. So that was viewed as wasteful, but also creating risks of fire because of so much slash being left. And then the other is a very strong dislike of fire and insects, which to the eyes of this sort of future utilitarian value of the forest, these fires and insects were destroying, potential gains. So the BC Ministry of Forests was established in 1912, and it kind of adopted those principles. Its main objectives were to reduce waste, eliminate fire, and ensure more resources for future generations.
Yeah, it's got to love that classic war on fire, right? Yeah. It set us up really well for climate change.
Yeah, exactly. And so that exact same thinking was really formalized in sustained yield forest management in 1948, which sought to have a continuous or even perpetually increasing supply of timber by managing the forest with a maximum sustained yield and using innovative silviculture to try to increase the amount of timber. So at that point, and those policies kind of intersected with major rural development policies and the post-war boom. So that's when we see highways being built all throughout the interior of British Columbia. We see communities popping up, up in the north where that timber was previously inaccessible. And we see that kind of eliminate wildfire attitude being applied across all the regions of BC, and being applied with the added advantage of, highly mechanized and effective industrial fire suppression technologies.
Yeah. I don't know why this came to mind, but it makes it seem like a disease or something, but like an alien. But I was like, I'm just imagining the tendrils of Western culture reaching into the rest of Canada, right? And you're just up here, we can do some stuff up here. And it's, it was just survival back then. It was just making the most out of what's around. But it's it's funny. I'm always cautious not to like demonize the cultures of the past for not really understanding what they're doing, but still being responsible for what they did.
Yes, and that's a tough line to walk, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure, right? Yeah. How do I say, yeah, it was okay that you made a living for yourself, but also, what about everyone else?
Yeah.
All the other values. Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing when you look at these early institutional functions is like they were kind of well intended, you might argue, right? Like,
sure, totally.
wise use conservation. Of course, this is all happens in a very colonial context and with very little regard to indigenous land rights and the needs of indigenous people.
Of course.
So this is hard to, in my mind, to avoid. But at the same time, when you look at these documents and what they were thinking, it's like, yeah, they were thinking about the future, and the future
their
looked
future.
Good.
Yeah, their future. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. and then a couple interesting things about the development of sustained yield in British Columbia is, so as I mentioned, it happened with the post-war boom, which was like kind of 2 decades of economic prosperity following World War II. But during that time, forest management was seen very favorably, it seems, from the better part of the public in BC. Like it seemed that people were happy that there were jobs being created.
Yeah.
This concept of tree farms resonated with, the colonial agricultural mentality, perhaps. But this idea of sort of long-term, ongoing benefits from forest management. So yeah, people were pretty happy until, of course, the environmental movement began. People started to notice that that this was not looking good for the landscapes of BC. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's worth mentioning at this point that the sustained yield is premised quite explicitly on the idea of removing all old forests and converting them to managed stands, right?
So that's interesting. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. And so they and in fact, there's like a very fine science of this. Like there's formulas used for calculating the amount of timber and for prioritizing the older forest first. And it was seen that bringing, the old growth forest landscape into a regulated forest condition was desirable from a forest management perspective.
Right.
So that
was progress.
Yeah. So that was the institutional function. And sure enough, it succeeded in its aim. It converted a lot of the old growth forests into managed stands, and that was happening on the coast. And then in the interior, where we used to have a lot of fire, and that fire was really important because it maintained structural complexity on the landscape. It was intrinsic to the health of ecosystems. It was effectively eliminated, and so we start to see what was historically this complex patchwork of all sorts of different forest ages and stands kind of becoming more uniform and contiguous across the landscape and essentially setting the stage for, the story like mountain pine beetle epidemic, which came along in the early 1990s and killed 18 million hectares of forests, and then the wildfires that we've been seeing for the past 2 decades as well.
Yeah. The point is there was a lot of good intentions, and those good intentions weren't very helpful in the end. They required a little more context, and that's fascinating. That I didn't realize that about the BC sustained yield, is that it was based off of the complete conversion of the landscape at some point, right? Which automatically, if you're including the entire forest and none of that old growth is being removed, then you know that you're not harvesting sustainably. Just very, very simply, right? And obviously, as times change, we've added parks, we've added all kinds of things, and so in a very simple manner, there was an oversimplification of the sustained forest management system for sure.
Yes, and so you can see how my definition of sustainability is really in no way similar to sustained yield forestry. Like sustained yield forestry, as it was originally envisioned, at least, was really premised on maximizing timber, and it really wasn't. I think for foresters, it's implicit that you should be also mitigating impacts on all these other values such as wildlife. But it really wasn't until like the 1970s and 80s that economists started trying to build models that could start to factor in multiple other values as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it just wasn't, we didn't have the capacity, we didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have the something, but we're in a situation now and we got to figure it out.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Yes. So anyway, back to our story of we had sustained yield being implemented in the late 1940s, and then the environmental movement comes along and says, "Hey, well, you're reducing all the old growth forests and causing widespread ecological degradation," because at those times there was no rules or practices about how that was to be done, right? So you'd see these huge clear cuts starting from one end of the valley, moving their way up, removing every single last tree. And so there was a major uproar, and a new government was elected in the early 1990s. It was the NDP government, and they campaigned on a promise to try to address these environmental impacts of forestry. And the solution, as they came about, was to implement environmental forestry practices. So the Forest Practices Code was introduced in 1995, and many heralded it as breaking new ground really in forest management globally, like addressed a number of different values. There's, I believe, 11 different values that have to be managed alongside timber, such as biodiversity, which might involve leaving some structural integrity and dead trees on the landscape, but also soils and water and wildlife and all these other things. Mm-hmm. But and so this is where this question of path dependency really comes in.
Okay.
So we had the best intentions, let's say. We introduced world-class environmental forestry practices. But these new practices were effectively layered on top of everything that had been there previously. So these new functions are added every 10 or 30 years, but they're kind of just layered as an additional policy layer on top of the old ways of doing things.
Right.
So the Forest Practices Code didn't really do anything to remove the emphasis of sustained yield in forest management in BC. Effectively, it was like a constraint imposed on top of the existing institutional function. So gotcha. You can see how it may not have really addressed some of the big structural issues and how we manage forests, although it for sure improved how we manage things at like the local scale, at the local stand scale, and it made a number of, other, like there's a lot of solutions that can happen at the stand scale, so don't get me wrong. But it didn't fundamentally change the policy environment of forest management in BC.
Sure. It was a big step up, but it was still just a Band-Aid. Yeah.
Yeah, and exactly. And we've done lots of other great things since then as well. We've developed all sorts of new paradigms of land use planning, but very rarely do any of these forestry practices or land use plans really scale back sustained yield. So, let's say landscape A is supposed to produce 1 million cubic meters of timber per year. The land use planning that comes in, the environmental forestry practices, they have to somehow uphold that sustained yield, like somehow protect biodiversity and old growth forests and wildlife, and result in better outcomes that are in line with people's cultural values on that landscape, but somehow do so without really reducing the amount of timber we expect to get from the landscape. So it's kind of what again Gary refers to as like the timber bias. Like we're just kind of locked into this system. We've sunk in so much effort into figuring out how to do this. Yep. We've sunk in lots of money into planting those trees that we plan to harvest. We've developed undergrad programs that people like myself have been through learning how the system works. There's so much complexity and interconnections and sunk costs that it's really difficult for the government to really step away from all of that.
For sure.
That's sort of
and
what that path dependency is all about.
Totally. And I mean, it was a sound concept at the beginning, right? We're like, hey, listen, the forest is the trees, is how we saw it, right? Like it was, like I said, it was a timber bias. And it was like, well, if we take care of the trees, if we make sure there's always trees, then everything else should follow along. Right. And we're like, hey, that seems like a pretty smart idea. Okay, let's try that out. Let's try this whole thing out. The problem was it wasn't like we were allowing the trees to get back to their previous pre-harvest state before coming back and reharvesting again. It was just about volume coming through the mill, and it wasn't fully fledged out to the way that we would like. So it was the beginnings of good thinking, the beginnings of sustainability, but it wasn't and still is not quite there. And like Gary would say, we're probably never going to be sustainable. We'll always be moving towards it, which is okay as long as we're continue to move.
Yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned the last in the paper. You mentioned that like kind of in the last few decades, there's been more changes like this, right? There's been a lot more. There's been a bunch more changes into the forest management system, trying to add more value to those non-timber values into the system, right? So starting to protect First Nations rights, Indigenous rights, I should say, starting to protect more biodiversity, more water, species at risk, and the simple, wow factor of old growth and everything else that they provide, right? Putting more of that onto the landscape. And you go into it, but you continue to mention that a lot of this is more of those Band-Aids. It doesn't seem to address this underlying problem of sustained yield forest management kind of in the Forest Act. And that you turn them adaptive changes, right? Adaptive changes, which continue to adapt the current system. But in the end of the paper, you mentioned that transformational change is needed, right? So transformational change. So I feel like BC is kind of going through that, a version of that right now with the old growth review, and lots of things are changing in a real way. So maybe you want to go into that a little bit more. The transformational change. What in your mind does that look like? How is that different from this adaptive changes that we've been doing in the past?
Yeah, I'd be pleased to. And so just a couple definitions. Like, adaptive changes are incremental changes to an existing system to, meet or adjust to new conditions. Mm-hmm. Whereas transformative changes are higher level changes, usually involving inclusion of diverse or previously excluded voices and potentially changing the fundamental structure of a system.
Yeah. So would you say it's like a wipe it clean and start from scratch, or is it a little more complicated than that?
Nothing ever starts from scratch. So we're continuously moving forward, complex adaptive system, and we're always going to be changing. And so you're always going to see things changing around you. And whether we're talking about forest management or your own perspective of the world or your friends group, like, everything is complex adaptive system. And the belief, there's a lot of theory about this, and this theory is usually grounded in quite a lot of empirical case studies, that in order to remain resilient, systems have to change. Like, that's just an integral part of being resilient, is adapting and sometimes transforming so that system can persist and ideally continue to provide some of the essential functions that we want it to provide.
Yep, absolutely.
So for me, and how I conceptualize this in the case of British Columbia, is those new policies, those new institutional functions, those are adaptations to changing social or ecological contexts. Whereas transformation, we really have not seen since the original transformation that happened at colonization. Like, that was a clear transformation in this landscape. Fundamentally, the provincial government came in, became the main kind of mediator of all social ecological relationships.
Yeah, could you imagine? You go from 20 different communities of Indigenous peoples managing very locally their own local forest, to someone shows up and draws a line on the Rocky Mountains and goes, yeah, we got everything west of this. It's all us. Don't worry about it. We got this. And you're like, wait, this, you can't possibly be totally attuned to the entire forest from that level, right? Like, Colonialism. It's a fun one to contemplate. we really thought a lot of ourselves, didn't we?
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of rabbit holes we could go down on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, as we say in this paper, there is some reason to believe that we may be, on the cusp of some transformation here in BC. And I didn't expand on this too much in the paper, but I did suggest that the Great Bear Rainforest, which is a major sort of land use planning zone on the central coast of British Columbia, has arguably gone through a transformation. So ecosystem-based management is being applied as the main paradigm of land management across this quite large area. And what that looks like is, they rescinded or dialed back all the forest tenures that were in there. So, forest harvesting was going to transform all the old growth forests into regulated stands. They dialed all that back so that that's only going to happen on like 15% of the land base. And they, have elevated First Nations as decision makers in the area, and they've created new types of conservation zones where there's some limited use. So it's not like a strict kind of build a wall around it kind of conservation idea. It's more like a conservation idea of stewarding the ecological integrity, but also recognizing First Nations culture as sort of integral to those zones. And then more broadly, I think there's reason to be optimistic that some of those recommendations from the Old Growth Strategic Review are kind of transformative. So most importantly, making First Nations decision makers or shared decision makers in all manners affecting old growth. That's coming back to this idea of institutional structure, and it's saying, okay, let's change the relationships and how this whole system works. Let's include First Nations people who have historically been excluded from making those decisions. And let's, and listening to Gary in the last episode, that's complicated and that's going to take some time. So it's not like a snap your fingers and that's solved our problems, but I think that's the right direction. And then the other recommendation is to make ecosystem health the fundamental goal of forest management. So as I've been saying in our conversation so far, timber is the overarching goal. Let's knock that one out. Let's put ecosystem health there so that timber is on a sort of equal playing field with all these other ones. So I think those are in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. You use timber harvest as a means to establishing some goal of ecosystem health, right? Knowing that this is I'm kind of speaking ahead of episodes here, but there's a conversation I'm hoping to have with somebody talking about this idea that we mimic natural disturbances as a forest harvest, right? However, the problem is a forest harvest is nothing like a natural disturbance. It does very different things than a fire does, right? A fire leaves all of the trees standing and takes all the branches and fine matter. A harvest does the exact opposite. And there's more to it than that, but generally that's the main difference. And the idea that I hope to explore in that episode is the concept of maybe we need to stop thinking of ourselves as trying to be like nature, and maybe we need to just be like us. And we need to take in all the factors. We have the capacity to pull in all these values that we want to manage for, and to actively, we're not going to nail it every time, but we can try to actively manage the forest in a way of okay, this is a very specific spot. We want to manage for whatever caribou habitat in this spot. We also want to pull some timber from it for X, Y, and Z reasons, break up the landscape, make it less prone to fire or whatever it might be, right? There's a million things you could be doing it for. And I think, to me, that's an interesting idea. Of instead of just assuming, hey, let's mimic nature, it's hey, how about we're pretty smart. We've got a lot of science going on here. Maybe we can come up with something, stop pretending to be nature, sans people, and start pretending to just be us and try to actively manage in a way that maybe is new, because forest harvest is not natural disturbance. It's totally different, and we can't treat it as such. So I'm excited to explore that idea, because I think it can, like you said, if you treat forest health as the ultimate goal, all kinds of options open up. But it's not like you stop harvesting. Will be lots of harvesting. It just changes the focus, changes the goal, right? And yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah.
I love it. Really, really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, and I like that as well. And I think it would be particularly nice to frame in an inclusive perspective with First Nations, because in a way, like, our attempt to emulate natural disturbance is like a Western scientific paradigm. But I think that if and I don't want to idealize too much here, but a lot of First Nations who have wisdom on this matter, they might intuitively tend towards that, even without kind of framing it within some existing scientific framework. So
sure. And I think the only reason I would say that from the Western perspective, it's just we have so much more of a bigger impact because there's arguably more of us. And even if there's not more of us, our footprint is much, much bigger, right? So I think it changes the relationship between human and forest from one that, pre-colonization, First Nations could do that in a sustainable way. And now after colonization, we're looking at a different world. It's a different space. So, but yeah, I totally know what you mean. But yeah, the idea of forest health is huge. It's everything, right? And so I wanted to ask you, so, okay, we want to move to transformational change, right? What is the biggest roadblock to achieving transformational change?
Oh, the biggest roadblock, like, to think outside the box, I'd say it's a lack of imagination. Really. Right. Like, we have so many talented and highly trained foresters and natural resource policymakers. We really do. I really believe that. And yet, I don't know if we create the space that we need to, again, like, accept our humility and envision what our future should look like. And I think that's really, that's what we need to be doing. I was recently reading a paper about how to frame powerful questions, and it cited Albert Einstein, who used to ask himself the craziest questions, because he was a brilliant guy, right?
Yeah.
And so he used to ask himself, what would it look like if I was riding at the edge of a light beam through the universe? And that's the kind of questions he asked himself to create, to come up with, like, the theory of relativity. So,
yeah.
So
thought
I think
experiments,
that we need,
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And there is, a whole genre of academic thought about how do we think and envision the future. And one of the main barriers is a lack of imagination, where we're too caught up in doing things the way that we've known to do them, or to make these incremental adaptive changes. But we need to be hosting forums and discussions to really imagine what the future of our forest management system might look like. Not what's possible 5 years. We need to be doing that as well, but also 100 years or 7 generations down the line. What's it going to look like?
250. Yeah. Totally. That makes sense. So yes, you were talking about a lack of imagination. I also feel like what I said before, maybe it's a comfort. So it's a fear of the future a little bit. So we're comfortable where we are, and we need to change, because I feel like those conversations are happening all the time. Every professional I talk to is talking the way we're talking right now, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like these ideas are unknown to them. They're aware, and they're like, yeah, we need to do that. But there's a hesitancy to do it, and so we're comfortable. Maybe we're being a little bit complacent because of that. And I also wonder, based off the conversation we've just had about institutional pathways and how I also feel like, so let's imagine we have all these people, all these professionals that are aware of this. They want to go here. It almost seems like they're maybe handcuffed a bit by those institutional pathways to make that change. Like you said, it's become very, very difficult to make that change because there's policies and legislation and a structure that stops it from happening, right? Because I don't feel like this is radical conversation we're having. I feel like the entire forest community across, at least I can say BC and Alberta, because that's where I am, are having this conversation and are aware. And so why isn't it happening? Which is why I asked the question about the roadblock, right? So maybe, imagination, comfort, it's difficult. No one wants to take on that task. I don't know. It's weird, right? Like, it's just very strange to be hitting your head against this wall over and over. And we're all like, yeah, we need to do it. And it's not happening.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. You're right. Like, foresters do love to have these conversations, and it's kind of baked into our way of thinking when we work with these like long-lived organisms, is that we do kind of think in the future.
Yeah. It's weird.
I mean, I want to say, like, this isn't just a forestry thing. This is like a rest of the world thing.
Yeah.
People have described like the social bystander effect, where, out of complacency or just a sheer belief that you cannot make a difference, we will choose to not, intervene in a situation where we clearly should intervene.
Right.
So that might be it. But at the same time, I feel like foresters are generally pretty good at that. I see so many people in the forestry community who are clearly leaders. They are taking steps, and a lot of them are interviewed on your show, and others, like, there's a lot of leadership. I think, and maybe I'll just speculate a bit here, but maybe it is like the sheer complexity of it that we encounter when we try to really envision what that system looks like.
It's overwhelming.
So, yeah. So there's maybe like, we have visionaries who like to talk about how we should be doing things differently, but we also need them to be working like with analytical folks we need to like get together and create that forum where we can couple these visions, where we can get it done. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Get the boots on the ground. Let's actually do something. Let's try something. Let's see what we can do when we put all this brain power and pontificating into action, right? Like, yeah, that's funny. And I say this as part of this community and arguably part of the problem that has these conversations, but I'm not doing a lot about it. So it's kind of funny.
I think you are. Right? Yeah, I think you are. Yeah.
But I'm not putting it into action, though. That's the issue. So that's my next step. I'll start working on that in my career.
Yeah. No, I think forum is close to action. So I think we're on the right track here.
Yeah. So this ties well into the 2016 paper. Like I was saying before, I want to tie this back into something actionable. This was unplanned, but I'm going to go with it. It's a nice flow, right? Actionable. I like this. This is good. So the 2016 paper, the research paper, you were quantifying. I'll say the name of it just to put it out there, and I'll link all this in the show notes so everyone has access to this.
Sure. Great.
Okay. Recovery trends for multiple ecosystem services reveal nonlinear responses and long-term trade-offs from temperate forest harvesting. In this paper, you talked about quantifying non-timber values. Now, this is a concept that I've asked a few guests in the past. Okay. So we're talking about removing timber as the number one focus of forest management and making it a co-value, making timber harvesting or timber acquisition, wood acquisition, a co-value with ecosystem services and everything else, right? So they're on an equal playing field. And to me, the issue with that is that we have no way of comparing ecosystem services and timber harvesting as a one-to-one relationship, right? And so I've been asked people, how do we create like a decision matrix? Like you put in all this is the inventory, this is what's here, there's this First Nation is here, these are their values, and like this is not going to happen, but I'm imagining a future AI scenario, right, where you can just like put in all the values and it'll tell you, okay, the best thing you can do here for a harvest plan is to leave this patch, cut over here, do some single stems over here, thin this out, and this will maximize all of the co-values that you have, and you'll remove some timber as well, right? And we've talked about it a lot. I've had the conversation, but this is the first time I've had someone who's actually done the work. So I want to ask you, okay, so how do we go about, based off this 2016 paper that you did and whatever else you have to add to it, this is a big deal. So you figure out a way to quantify it and compare them. So can you go into that for us? Explain how do you quantify these and then when we're done that, how can institutions, we'll say, whether it's the government or a company or whoever, start to apply that to their current system?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So in that paper, there's some limits, which I'll state right off the bat, which is that we were really only measuring biophysical structures within the forest,
Yes.
and then using that as a proxy to estimate the capacity of a given forest stand to provide multiple ecosystem services. So anytime, like, I love your idea of, creating a supercomputer that can generate answers to this complex trade-off question. It's always still going to be a social values question and decision, right? Like,
totally.
But the way that work we did in 2016, that was my master's degree, fits in is, even if it's a social question, we need to advance our methods and data and so forth for how we measure and recognize these different values.
Right.
First there's a social process. It's like, okay, what are the important values? It's not just timber, it's also large cultural heritage trees, it's dead trees, it's coarse woody debris, wild edible berry producing plants, habitat for marbled murrelets, large western red cedars used in First Nations carving, et cetera, et cetera. The next step is to kind of go out and develop some indicators and frameworks for how we could actually monitor those on the landscape. And, this is really, ecosystem service kind of framework is well suited for that. There's tons of literature, tons of people showing how to do this. You can do that at the stand scale. You can do that at the landscape scale. But yeah, developing better data and methods is a fundamental part of that equation. And speaking with some consultant colleagues who are working on forest landscape plans, they're like, we need better data. Like, we're being asked to model all these different values to lead to better decisions, but we don't know how to do that. And kind of what I tell them is, like, we kind of have the data, we just aren't using it properly. We don't have the scientific frameworks to turn that data in a credible way into depiction of multiple values. We have some of that, not all of it.
Yeah.
And there's different ways to do that. Like, in that paper, I think it's pretty helpful because we show how you can take readily available structural attribute data and use it as a proxy for multiple values. You could go steps further, like in another recent research project we did in Indonesia. We used focus group workshops and participatory mapping. So, we gathered local people who live in that landscape. We said, what are the ecosystem services most important to you? Which ones do you want more of in the future? Where do you use these? And we got them to actually map the locations of where they go to collect drinking water or to hunt or to harvest non-timber forest products. So that kind of participatory approach is extremely useful, because otherwise we never really know how people feel about and are interacting with the landscape, which varies from region to region, and it's like the social ecological complexities of it. We can't really generalize that too easily.
Totally, and it changes from decade to decade too.
Yeah. So anyway, there's that whole information gathering phase. We need better data on multiple ecosystem services, or however we want to frame that. And then there has to be like a structured decision-making process of some kind, like some way of laying those values out, thinking about what they all mean, it's not just a question of what's important and who's using it, but it's like, how do those people value it? Do they value this large tree because it's intrinsic to their sense of identity as a family? Like, well, then that large tree cannot be substituted with anything else. It cannot be removed. If it's more a question of, harvesting wild mushrooms or harvesting non-timber forest products, well, maybe that could be removed because it could be substituted by having access to a different location.
Right.
So there's a lot of dimensions to it. There's kind of the ecological, biophysical, what's on the landscape. There's the social question of where are people actually accessing and using these resources. And then there's the values question of, like, what does this actually mean?
Right.
How how much can we sacrifice on different things? And then ideally, I mean, based on that, you could then construct, a structured decision-making process that kind of weights the different values. And usually the next step is to kind of explore different alternatives. Like here's sort of like landscape one in the future. Here's a different version of the landscape with more forest harvesting or less forest harvesting. This is what that future would look like if wildfire increases 50%. And then by getting together, you can kind of envision that future, and there can be additional kind of exchange and learning.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of my vision of what that process would look like. But
yeah. No, totally. I imagine, like, it's funny every time whenever I ask this question, I want to push it to like a dollar value thing, because that's the way our society works. Our society works off dollars, right? And if you could say, like, okay, so like you said, you get a cedar that it's intrinsic to that family's cultural identity or whatever it might be, and you're like, okay, this has a cultural value of, it's got a dollar value of whatever, $10 billion, right? Because you're like, this is a no-no. We're not going there. Like, and then you go to, the other things, right? Like putting a dollar value to mushroom harvesting, putting a dollar value to salmon fishing, to water quality, to blah, 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 everything. Right. And then putting that in the Excel spreadsheet and then doing the math. And like, that's what I want. I would love to get that. And I just don't know. The problem is that putting a dollar value to those things is so subjective, because depending on who you ask and how you measure it. So to find an objective means to measuring that becomes incredibly complicated, and like maybe one day it'll exist, but in the meantime, we're just trusting in professionals to try and be objective and try to include as many perspectives as possible outside of their own when they're making this decision. And that's a big ask, right? Like, you're like, and it's not to say that I don't trust professionals. Like I am one of those professionals, but I do trust them. But I also know that there's a lot of things I don't know, and I'm not set up really well to make the best decision, because sure, I really understand the ecology of the landscape, but that's not all there is, right? I can't speak to indigenous values. I can try and hedge my bets, but that's the best I can do. So I feel like that's the next big breakthrough in this, is creating an actual one-to-one relationship of like forest harvesting versus blah, blah, blah. Or not versus, but like, putting that all together. But who knows when we'll ever get there. In the meantime, it's on us.
No, I see where you're going. Like, we're kind of operating in a subjective decision-making framework. Whereas moving to a more structured economic decision-making framework would somehow be more transparent. I guess
in a capitalist society, right? Like in a capitalist society,
in the current system, not in an ideal system. I hear
exactly.
you.
Yeah.
I guess one concern I would have about that, and because I've thought about this, and I agree. Ideally, that would work really nicely.
Right.
I guess one concern is that when you start trying to put those prices on, that might create more division than it's worth. So
good point.
If you're trying to make a decision that's agreeable to the community, you might actually be putting up barriers much earlier than you would want to. By
good point.
Even if you're being generous, like $20 billion for the large tree.
Yeah.
And I feel like starting from a sort of Western economic cost benefit analysis point of view will already be excluding people. So I mean, what I would say is like I'm based here at SFU now, and there's a bunch of brilliant scholars and consultants out of this area that have come up with like the structured decision-making framework, or at least they've kind of formalized that and wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
And I kind of think that's the way to go. Like it doesn't require a traditional cost benefit analysis, but it's kind of similar. It just means that you have to assign some subjective weights or some importance scores to different values.
Yeah.
But by doing that in a very transparent way, with ideally as much kind of like social inclusion as possible, you can make it like a credible, transparent process that leads you towards it's not as simple as decision as like a cost benefit analysis. Like it usually will lead towards a selection of different alternatives.
Right.
So it's hard for me to really answer this question because I'm
it's
mostly an
impossible
academic.
For everybody to answer this question. Nobody,
Yeah.
it's not something we can answer because you're asking someone to step completely outside of their realm of understanding and imagine something totally novel, right? Like it's
yeah. And I'm mostly an academic, like more than anything. So, for
Sure.
me, the answer is kind of research.
Yeah.
But I love engaging with those kind of questions and thinking about what that would actually look like. And I think that that's an important question to carry forward because that is what we should be asking. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah. No, I like it too. I think it's at the end of the day, I started this podcast thing to ask those fun having a beer with your friends questions, right? Like, what if we did this, right? Like, yeah, like it's always that kind of stuff that makes it fun to contemplate. So yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate the input. That was great. So diving back into the 2023 paper, and you guys came up with some pretty good takeaways that were very simple, straightforward, and relate back really well to everything that you've been saying, right? So maybe you want to jump into these three things, add some context, however you want to do it, to lay these three recommendations. Did you call them? I think for stepping into
we
the
frame
future?
them as recommendations.
Yeah.
So the first is kind of what everybody's been saying for a long time, which is to manage the forest more locally.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, we've got this vast landscape and this single centralized government with, lots of different regional branches and stuff. But one single policy, it's just a really difficult to effectively monitor changes that's happening, to really understand the local values that are important, and to make management decisions that reflect all of that. So in BC, we've had an experiment of community forests for, I guess it's been over 20 years now, and we've increasing tenure distribution to these community forests and to First Nations woodlots, and those have been a huge success. We've put local communities in charge of managing the forests that surround their communities. It's a lot easier to have a chance for local people to have a say, to have forums that decisions can reflect relatively more holistically the desires of people living there. And it's also proved a great experiment because every community forest is a little different, right? So they experiment with slightly different ways of doing things. And then we have a sort of annual symposium that they can share their lessons. And effectively, each one of those community forests is like an experiment. And there's a whole process of social learning generated from it. So
they're really interesting. I forget the name of the one that I interviewed on here last year, but they were talking about, because it's a community-owned forest, right? All those dividends, all that extra revenue goes straight back into the community, right? And you're like, so you're lifting up that community at the same time that you're managing to manage for ecosystem health or for forest health, right? Like it's a really cool feedback loop, and I loved it. It was just a great conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's part of a broader discussion that's very complex about sort of what is the ideal, spatial scale of institutions and how are they supposed to work in concert to effectively manage a large land base. And that's something that, again, Gary's got lots of perspective on. But ideally, like in my mind, and this is partly informed by sort of broader theory, is that a polycentric governance system would be more resilient for managing the forests of BC. So, we'd still retain a central provincial government, which has an important role in coordinating the management of wide-ranging species and distributing funds, and making strategic decisions that affect the whole area. But definitely also more agency at smaller scales and more capacity for monitoring and adaptive management at much more local scales.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. Yeah, like you said, everyone's saying that, right? That's being said across Canada. So Yeah. I think we're on
Yeah.
board with that one.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah, and I'm actually really excited about that direction in British Columbia, like with First Nations becoming shared decision makers and having more agency over their traditional territories and community forests. Like, I'm a bit optimistic actually that we are moving in the direction of developing a resilient governance system for managing our forests. And it doesn't feel like that when you look at how much wildfires are happening and stuff, but it seems like from a governance perspective, we're moving in the right direction.
It does feel really cool. Absolutely. I agree. Yeah, it's very hopeful. Lots of new cool things happening for sure.
Yeah, and so that's the perfect segue to our next recommendation,
right?
To maintain. Yeah, so that's sort of the governance institutional scale bit, and then the second bit is kind of similar to what the Old Growth Strategic Review said in terms of managing for health. But what we're saying is to maintain and restore complex landscapes. So resilient landscapes ecologically are going to be ones with, heterogeneity at the stand scale and at the landscape scale, and with natural disturbance intrinsically a part of them, or at least emulated. So somehow we need to move back towards figuring out what our interior landscapes once look like. Should we be actively restoring them towards that, or at least how can we be making decisions moving forward so that we're not, producing these homogeneous, very sensitive landscapes throughout the interior?
Yes. Yeah. No, totally. It makes sense that, shifting perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third recommendation is to foster capacity to adapt and transform institutions through reflective processes. So this recommendation is like, people are like, wait, what? Did you say like reflection?
Yeah.
And so this is coming a little bit from the experience of myself and some of my co-authors in transdisciplinary research and working on the climate crisis and really complex natural resource management challenges. And there's this important role of constantly reflecting. Like that's something that foresters do. That's actually mandated by, we have our professional practice diary, at least in British Columbia, that's mandated by the Professional Governance Act, that we are supposed to be constantly, recording our activities and reflecting on the implications of that for how we should be practicing forestry in the future.
Okay. Yeah. Love that.
Yeah. And then in the historical context of BC, there's always been a commission or a strategic review of some kind that had preceded all of the major policy changes. So, before the BC Ministry of Forests was created in 1912, we had the Fulton Commission of 1910. Before sustained yield was implemented in 1948, we had the Sloan Commission of 1945. And we've had 4 or 5, or maybe a couple more than that, of these like royal commissions or resource commissions. And those have been opportunities to really to allow somebody who's relatively independent, who doesn't work for government, but is well informed of how the system works, to do kind of like a deep dive, talk to a lot of people, look at the way things are, ask, why are they like that? Is that the way that they should be? What should they look like in the future?
Yeah.
How is that supposed to work? Or who's even supposed to know that? So it's very clear that these commissions are this integral part of evolving our forest management institutions.
Yep.
And in general, like, we kind of suggest that this should happen a little bit more frequently. Like it shouldn't be once every 3 decades. Maybe it should be once every 10 years or 15 years. I'm not sure. And they should be more inclusive, ideally. So not only professional foresters or people who work at the UBC Faculty of Forestry, which is who usually does it, but maybe incorporate a broader selection of individuals from different disciplines who might have different perspectives to come to bear, such as, a social scientist who's not an economist, or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. And as I said, I'm kind of optimistic about what the Old Growth Strategic Review was envisioning. And so So definitely these sort of like this creating this kind of forum for reflection and asking these deep questions of, yeah, where do we want to go from here? That's an integral process for sustainability, I think.
Yeah, I love that one. Just imagining it's a foresty thrum. Everyone gets together and it creates a brainstorm that just like pushes us in the right direction, right? Like it's I love that idea. Yeah, no, like reflective practice, right, is everything, right? So don't just do, I think, like we've said a couple times throughout this, we get complacent in our comfort. We have to shed off that comfort and try to reflect on, okay, what I did today actually, how did that actually impact the landscape, the ecology, the societal values? How might I have done that differently? How could I think about this differently, right? And that's the big one, I think, really, too, is the way we conceptualize a forest. Foresters tend to, we tend to see the trees, right? We describe everything as a tree. Oh, that's a pine forest. That's a spruce forest. That's a cedar forest. That's a Doug fir forest. That's an aspen forest. And that's how we're defining it. And to start to expand that into something bigger, right? Like if you're a forager, you're like, oh yeah, that's my berry patch. That's my mushroom patch. That's where I go hunt deer. That's my whatever, right? Like there's so many different ways of conceptualizing the forest, and that reflective practice, and that I like the idea of the, what do you call it, the commission, right? The bringing all the stakeholders in and having that reflective conversation about, okay, what's going on with you? What are some of your holdups? What's happening here? How do we work together to push this forward in a more effective way, right? That's huge, absolutely.
And the history part's really important as well. Like, there's a lot of increasing recognition that we live in a colonial system, and a lot of the fundamental inequalities that we're dealing with today hark back 150 years to the way things were set up through the process of colonization.
Yeah.
So I feel like some of the old growth strategic review kind of does reflect back to that in the scope of its recommendations, but it's definitely that sort of, if we're going to do that reflection and we're going to think about institutions, we need to recognize that our institutions have evolved from the past and bear a lot of continuous threads from that time. So yeah, we need sort of some deep historical reflection and future visioning of what we want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. Yeah. So to sum up, you got more local power, more local management, able to do what they need to do in their local vicinity based off their specific ecology and societal needs. And then you've got this shift from timber management to a forest health perspective as the number one priority. And then finally, this concept of reflecting on everything that we just talked about and deciding, okay, was that the right way? How do I shift my perspective? How do I change? How do I bring in more? All of that. Yeah, of course. I love it. It seems, yeah, it lines up really well with the old growth review, right? So it's a great conversation. And I think these are the type of conversations that allow people to, maybe get out of their funk a little bit, right? It's if you've been stuck in one way of thinking, and, it's really good. I find especially, the ones that take you out of that colonial, like I didn't realize I had a colonial mindset. You know what I mean? There was one episode I had, I can't remember who I was speaking with. There's one episode I had, I think we were talking about treaties is what it was. There's an episode I have called Canada, a Treaty Story. Awesome. It was so good. And, he's a specialist on treaties, right? And we came in and talked about that, and he started talking about colonialism, right? And how that is my perspective. That is my mindset. He wasn't pointing it at me, but I was taking it that way. And I'm like, oh shit, you're right. And then realizing that there is another way to perceive the entire world. There's like just this way of organizing things. It's not the only way, but that's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, is try to remove. I still haven't done it totally, but I have moments of clarity. Yeah. But being able to remove your brain from that idea of thinking that this is the only way of thinking, and that there might be a totally different way of organizing and thinking that might be better in some regard, right? So I think these conversations open people up to being able to consume that and take that in and make that part of their reality, and, humble the humility a little bit, right? A little bit of humbleness. Like it's always good. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And we never fully move away from that. It's part of our past and
Yeah.
our culture. But it's a process of, ongoing learning and reflection that we learn to make the most of that and to live with it. We somehow have to create a lot of space inside of ourselves, inside our hearts to accept it all. Like we come from this incredibly complex past that defines our identities, and I don't know. We can live to accept that in a way that's actually incredibly empowering and uplifting.
Yeah.
And even if it's like, some people really struggle with this because it hits their identity square on. And, myself as a privileged white male, like it's sometimes uncomfortable to acknowledge this and sit through these conversations, but I've been working on it and I'm learning to really hold space for that all. And I've realized that can unlock really new ways of thinking about things and also relating with the land. And I think that fundamentally that's what this is about. Like,
Yeah.
do we go out to the forest and breathe it in and that breath is like empowering for ourselves in a way. Like that's a colonial relationship with the land, and that's how I've related with the forest for most of my life. But when you read people like Robin Kimmerer or other Indigenous writers, they talk about relating with the land through a perspective of kinship, like of viewing trees not as something that you can extract something from, but something that you simply exist with and are inseparable from. And I've actually only recently started to feel those relationships a little bit, and it's incredible.
That is cool.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating idea. I remember reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, and she was talking about one of her books, I should say, and then she was talking about that idea of kinship, right? And not using pronouns such as that, like that tree or it, or like she was talking about calling like a tree or a plant or an animal an it, a thing, an object that must be managed, right? Or must be dealt with. For her, she was talking about personalizing it, right? Calling it a she or a he, just because that's the pronoun that to us makes it a living being, right? Not that you have to use that one, but that's the one that clicks in our minds. And I found that really interesting. I was like, oh yeah, like calling it just like automatically that changes it to just like personalizes it a little bit, which might be personifying a tree, but which you can give or take and the whole conversation around that. But but it does change your relationship to it and makes you think twice about, okay, what should we do with this tree? And I love that idea, right? It's just reflective. Again, reflective. What am I really doing? What are the consequences of my actions? Let's really take this in, right? And I think that's all great, right? It's learning opportunity for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and like in a way, like, can we really transform these systems into something genuinely sustainable if we cannot transform ourselves first? So
sure.
I think that it really does begin sometimes with us, and yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I love that. No, I've loved this conversation, and I hope people don't walk away feeling constrained by their specific system of oppression that they're under, or whatever their institutional pathway that is maybe blocking their road to making a change that they want to make, right? I hope people don't feel handcuffed by that, because I think as we've discussed, it seems like although those institutional pathways may stand in the way of shifting institutions, and I mean that from a company or a government that also might want to maybe aiming to change the way they do things, but are finding a lot of roadblocks and a lot of difficulty in doing that. And I think that is the case in a lot of ways. Yeah, I hope people don't feel. I hope they didn't walk away from this feeling like there's no hope, because I think clearly that there is. Right? Clearly, now we're naming the problem. The problem is this colonial structure that we've managed to create for ourselves. How do we break free of that? And I think having the conversation is the first step to being able to do that, which is, naming the problem. It's good. I love it.
Yeah. And it is a story of hope. Like, my perspective is, yeah, we need to understand these systems if we want to intervene to really achieve and this is especially relevant for like transformation, right? Like if we really want to transform the system, we got to work from a whole system perspective. There's no other way. But
Yeah.
and I teach this to students that I talk to is like, but you don't have to always transform the system. There's good work to be done all over the place. And in fact, if we don't have good people doing good work in all sorts of different areas, we can't have any transformation, because we need to like empower all foresters or students or whoever to feel like they can be a leader in their own domain, right? So
absolutely.
I know so many great people, and yeah, many of them you've had on your show that they're just doing incredible work. Like they might work in a relatively small landscape with a particular thing, but the work they do is incredible, and it's generating that kind of learning that is integral to my sort of definition of sustainability. Like it's a continual process of learning and having the courage to share those lessons with other people and having the humility. And so I think it's an inherently sort of hopeful outlook actually that I have.
Yeah, me as well. I completely agree. I see from everyone from industry to government to NGOs to everyone, I feel like there's more and more of that conversation of being on the same page and just trying to find that path together of like, okay, how does this work? Because nobody has that. Nobody has that roadmap, and we're working it out together. And there may be competing perspectives on how to weight things or whatever, but I feel like everyone's looking in the same direction as far as what the future is going to look like, right? Which is a hugely hopeful idea that people might be coming together in that way, right? So, and I see that as well. I'm generally an optimist in that perspective. So I don't think I'd have this show if I wasn't.
Yeah.
I'd just be sitting here complaining about things.
Yeah. And to be fair, like there's also plenty of that in my PhD, like a lot of like, not things aren't looking good environmentally, but you have to also infuse that with a bit of optimism. So
yeah, absolutely. No, I tend to get my negativity out listening to like Father John Misty or something like that. Something that's just a negative viewpoint on entire Western society. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. That is bullshit. And then I move on with my day. It's great. So yeah, this was fantastic, Ira. I really appreciate the conversation. And, I don't know if there's anything left unsaid that you want to finish off with. Otherwise, I think we've done a pretty good job, from my perspective of covering the ground here and having a really robust conversation. That's lots to think about.
Yeah, no, I mean, really appreciate this sort of forum you're creating, and I'd love to see, ways of weaving it all together, like, totally. Like a mural or an illustration or something that somehow blends it all. And I really appreciate that you're asking some big questions, powerful questions that nobody knows the answer to. I think we should all be asking ourselves those questions and asking them in a way where it's not just like daydreaming. It's like kind of, Albert Einstein style, like actually pondering what would this look like? What would this look like for us to really achieve sustainability in forest management and conservation, and and to be respectful of each other and each other's views, and try to work towards that with a lot of humility, because we have our good ideas, but also our ideas are attached to learnings and things that might be in conflict with other worldviews. So so there's a lot of work to do, but I think as long as we're working on it over the long term while never disregarding the negative harms of the past, like then we can weave together a nice vision of the future.
Yeah. Let's not be married to our ideas, right? If we try something and it turns out that it's not working out, let's not just push ahead blindly being like, it'll work out. We can change course. That's the fun thing about that, right? If you come into it humility, knowing that like, okay, this thing didn't work out that I wanted to do. You probably learned a bunch of stuff. You can adjust course, you can change it, you can do different things. And that's what this is. Mm-hmm. This sustainability thing is, it's a lifelong pursuit, right? It's not an end goal, like Gary Merkel so eloquently put.
Yeah. So we gotta stay nimble in the journey.
Yeah, we gotta stick handle our way through there, right? To use a Canadian metaphor. Can't just push ahead blindly. Someone's gonna take you out. Yeah, no, for sure. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Ira. I really appreciate it. And this is fantastic.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me on your show and for helping to get the research out. And I really look forward to listening to it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for listening. What a great conversation. Really the first time I've had the opportunity to think about or to have somebody point out and really lay out the roadmap of look at this structure, look at the way we've organized our decision-making process, and look at how this is problematic. I thought it was nice because it made it a little clearer in my mind, a little more able to process and digest and really come out with the beginnings of solutions maybe, you know? So yeah, really, really cool. Thank you, Ira, for everything. Again, the paper is linked in the show notes. Check that out. Share this, throw it on social media, review it wherever you're listening to this. Really appreciate it. All right. Catch you all next time. Take it easy.